The FBI director herself burst through the doors of Oak Ridge Sheriff's Station, flanked by armed agents in tactical gear. "Release him immediately," she commanded, pointing at the handcuffed 68-year-old black man sitting calmly in the corner. "That's our nation's most valuable intelligence asset. You're treating him like a criminal." Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If this shocking moment of justice has your attention, hit that like button and subscribe to see how this small-town police station became ground zero for a federal intervention that exposed decades of injustice. What would you do if you witnessed an innocent man being wrongfully arrested? Stay tuned to see how one man's dignity in the face of discrimination changed an entire community. Edward Thompson rose at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just as he had done every day for the past 53 years of his life. Military precision never left a man, even 13 years into retirement. The 68-year-old former Air Force Chief Master Sergeant made his bed with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter off the surface, a habit that had survived decades of service and now 3 years of widowhood. His modest single-story home in Oak Ridge, Alabama, was immaculate, with everything in its proper place. Photographs lined the walls in perfect alignment. Edward in his dress blues, receiving commendations from 3 different presidents. Edward and his late wife, Clara, on their wedding day. Their daughter, Lisa, graduating from medical school. Subtle hints of his military past adorned the living room, a shadow box containing his numerous medals, including the Distinguished Service Medal and Bronze Star, a folded flag in a triangular case, and books on military strategy and intelligence operations, arranged by height on the bookshelf. Edward moved to the kitchen, where he prepared his coffee with the same precision he applied to everything else. 1 level tablespoon of grounds, water filled to the 6th cup line, timer set for 4 minutes. While the coffee brewed, he retrieved the Oak Ridge Tribune from his front porch. The morning air was already heavy with humidity, promising another scorching Alabama summer day. Edward settled into his recliner, unfolding the newspaper methodically. The headlines spoke of local concerns, budget issues for the school district, an upcoming town festival, and complaints about increased police patrols in certain neighborhoods. Edward knew which neighborhoods those would be without reading further. After Clara passed 3 years ago from cancer, Edward had decided to leave Washington, D.C., and settle in this small southern town where his cousin had lived. He'd wanted peace and quiet for his final years, somewhere he could reflect on his life of service. Oak Ridge had seemed perfect on paper. Affordable, quiet, with a VA clinic nearby. What the town brochures hadn't mentioned was the undercurrent of racial tension that existed beneath the surface pleasantries. Edward sipped his coffee, mentally planning his day. Wednesday meant grocery shopping and picking up his heart medication from Carter's Pharmacy. He dressed carefully in pressed khaki slacks and a light blue button-down shirt. Despite the heat, Edward believed in presenting himself properly, another military habit that had never faded. He polished his shoes before slipping them on, checked his wallet for his ID cards and the grocery list Clara had taught him to always prepare, and headed out to his meticulously maintained 10-year-old Buick. The drive into town took exactly 7 minutes. Edward parked in front of Miller's grocery, nodding politely to Mrs. Miller herself as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, with the practiced smile of a small-town shop owner. Some of the locals were genuinely friendly, respecting Edward's military background and dignified demeanor. Others viewed him with thinly veiled suspicion, an outsider who didn't quite belong, especially one who carried himself with such confidence. Edward methodically made his way through his shopping list, selecting each item with care. Fresh vegetables for the stir-fry he planned to make that evening, chicken breasts on sale, orange juice, and whole-grain bread. He exchanged pleasantries with those who offered them, and politely ignored the stares from those who didn't. After paying for his groceries, Edward drove the short distance to Carter's pharmacy. As he pulled into a parking space, he noticed a police cruiser parked nearby, 2 officers watching him through the windshield. Officers Ryan Carter and Jake Sullivan had been with the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department for just under 3 years. Carter, 27, stocky with close-cropped blonde hair, had a growing reputation among the black residents of Oak Ridge for random stops and searches. Sullivan, 25, lankier and more reserved, typically followed Carter's lead. Both watched as Edward entered the pharmacy. Inside, Edward greeted the pharmacist, Dr. Carter, who had his prescription ready. "Blood pressure still good, Mr. Thompson?" Carter asked as he rang up the medication. "Steady as she goes," Edward replied with a small smile. "Military discipline helps with following doctor's orders." As Edward paid for his medication and turned to leave, he noticed the 2 officers had entered the pharmacy and were browsing items near the entrance, occasionally glancing in his direction. Edward recognized the look. He'd seen it countless times before, in countless places across America and around the world. The look that said he was being assessed as a threat, not as a citizen. He tucked his receipt and medication into his pocket, straightened his shoulders slightly, and walked toward the exit with the measured pace of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. He had no way of knowing that this routine Wednesday was about to become anything but routine. Edward had just placed his grocery bags in the trunk of his Buick when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was young, authoritative, with that particular edge Edward had learned to recognize over his 68 years of life. He turned slowly, hands visible by instinct and training. Officers Carter and Sullivan stood 6 feet away, Carter slightly ahead, with his hand resting casually near his holster. "Yes, officers. Can I help you with something?" Edward responded, his voice steady and respectful, despite the immediate understanding of what was happening. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Carter said, eyes scanning Edward's car and groceries. "Mind telling us what you're doing here today?" Edward maintained his calm exterior, though inside he felt the familiar weight of recognition. This dance was as old as America itself. "Just picking up my weekly groceries and heart medication, officers. I live over on Cedar Lane. Been in Oak Ridge about 3 years now." Officer Sullivan nodded slightly, but Carter's expression remained fixed, skeptical. "You seem to be taking your time loading up, just standing around watching the parking lot." Edward looked directly at Carter, his military bearing automatic. "I was organizing my groceries, sir. Eggs and bread separate from heavier items." The respect in his voice was genuine, not for the man, but for the uniform and what it should represent. Edward had spent 35 years serving his country, including advising military police operations. He understood proper procedure, which made recognizing improper procedure all the more painful. "I'll need to see some identification," Carter said, taking a step closer. Edward reached slowly for his wallet, movements deliberate and telegraphed. His mind flashed to the briefings he'd given young airmen decades ago. When confronted, move with purpose, but never with haste. Haste can be misinterpreted as aggression or flight risk. He handed over his driver's license and VA identification card. Carter studied them with exaggerated scrutiny, while Sullivan maintained his position, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You know, you match the description of someone we're looking for in a convenience store robbery last night," Carter said, his tone suggesting he'd just found this connection rather than manufactured it on the spot. Edward felt a familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. "May I ask what that description was, officer?" His voice remained level, despite recognizing the well-worn script playing out. Carter's eyes narrowed. Male, black, older, driving an older model sedan. Edward nodded slowly. That's a rather broad description, officer. Could fit quite a number of people in this town. You questioning police work now? Carter's tone hardened. In that moment, Edward had a flash of memory. Saigon, 1972. Frankfurt, 1983. Washington, D.C., 1995. Different decades, different contexts, same underlying current of suspicion based on nothing but the color of his skin. He'd served through Vietnam, the Cold War, Desert Storm, all while facing the additional battle of proving his worth in a system that often viewed him with suspicion. First respect, second. No, sir, just trying to understand the situation, Edward replied. Carter handed the ID cards to Sullivan, then stepped toward Edward's car. Mind if we take a look inside your vehicle? It wasn't really a question. Before Edward could properly respond, Carter was already opening the passenger door. Sir, I don't consent to a search of my vehicle, Edward stated clearly, knowing his rights, despite suspecting they were about to be ignored. Got something to hide? Carter shot back, already rifling through the glove compartment. Edward noticed bystanders beginning to take notice. A young woman across the parking lot had her phone out, recording the encounter. Carter emerged from the car holding Edward's prescription bag. What's this? He demanded, though the pharmacy label was clearly visible. My prescription heart medication. You can see the pharmacy label right there, Edward explained patiently. Carter opened the bag, examining the pill bottle inside. These look like illegal pills to me. Sullivan finally spoke up, his voice quieter. They're clearly labeled prescription medication, Ryan. Carter shot his partner a warning look. People disguise illegal drugs all the time. We should take these in for testing. Edward felt the indignity burning in his throat, but kept his voice measured. Those are my heart medications, prescribed by Dr. Andrews at the VA clinic. I just picked them up from Carter's pharmacy not 10 minutes ago. You can call the pharmacist to verify. Several more bystanders had gathered now, watching the confrontation unfold. Edward could hear whispers, see more phones recording. Carter seemed to notice the audience too, which only made him double down. Sir, please place your hands behind your back. Edward's mind raced through options, evaluating them with the strategic thinking that had made him valuable to 3 presidential administrations. Resist? Comply? Every path seemed to lead to the same destination. On what charges, officer? He asked, knowing the answer would be insufficient. Interfering with a police investigation, possible possession of controlled substances. Carter's hand was on his handcuffs now. Edward looked at Sullivan, seeing the discomfort and uncertainty in the younger officer's eyes. Officer Sullivan, you know this isn't right, Edward said quietly. Sullivan looked away. With practiced dignity, Edward slowly placed his hands behind his back. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, the indignity of the moment washed over him. 68 years old, 35 years of military service, top-secret clearance, advisor to generals and presidents, and still, in this parking lot in Alabama, none of that mattered against the color of his skin. You're making a very serious mistake, Edward said quietly, as Carter began leading him toward the police cruiser. Not a threat, but a simple statement of fact that would prove prophetic within the hour. Comment number 1. If you've ever witnessed or experienced racial profiling, has our society made progress? Or are we still fighting the same battles decades later? Like and subscribe if you believe every American deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their skin color. The question remains, what happens when a decorated military veteran with high-level government connections gets treated like a common criminal. How quickly will the tables turn when the full weight of federal authority responds to this small-town injustice? The back seat of the police cruiser smelled of disinfectant and lingering sweat. Edward sat upright, military posture intact, despite the handcuffs biting into his arthritic wrists. Each bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through his joints, but his face remained impassive. He'd endured far worse physical discomfort during his career. The emotional weight, however, was another matter entirely. After 35 years of distinguished service to his country, after briefing presidents and generals, after helping develop intelligence protocols that had saved countless American lives, here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police car in a small Alabama town, arrested for being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. Edward glanced at his watch. 1,400 hours. He was scheduled for his weekly check-in call with former colleagues at 1600. These calls weren't just social. They were protocol for retired intelligence officers with his level of clearance and knowledge. Missing the call would trigger questions. In the front seat, Officers Carter and Sullivan discussed their catch, as if Edward couldn't hear them, or perhaps not caring if he did. "Told you something was off about him," Carter said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Always walking around town like he owns the place." Sullivan seemed less enthusiastic. "His ID checked out, though, military veteran and everything." "So, plenty of criminals are veterans, and those pills definitely looked suspicious," Carter replied. Edward noticed Sullivan glancing at him in the rearview mirror, uncertainty in his eyes. "You doing okay back there, sir?" Sullivan asked, earning a sharp look from Carter. "I've been better, officer," Edward replied, meeting Sullivan's eyes in the mirror. His mind drifted to other vehicles he'd ridden in. Military transports crossing jungles in Vietnam, armored cars in the Middle East, diplomatic vehicles in Eastern Europe during the height of the Cold War. His work in signals intelligence and counterterrorism had taken him across the globe, often in dangerous circumstances. None of those situations had made him feel as vulnerable as he felt now. The cruiser pulled into the small Oak Ridge Sheriff's Station, a one-story brick building with the county seal displayed prominently on the front. Carter opened the rear door. "Let's go," he said roughly, helping Edward out of the car. The station was busier than Edward had expected for a Wednesday afternoon. Several deputies looked up as Carter led him through to the processing area. A desk sergeant, an older white man with graying hair and a substantial belly stretching his uniform, looked up from his computer. "What have we got, Carter?" "Suspicious individual? Possible narcotics," Carter replied, pushing Edward's wallet and prescription bottle onto the desk. The sergeant, whose nameplate read Baxter, picked up Edward's military ID and studied it, then looked at Edward with slightly widened eyes. "Chief Master Sergeant." Edward nodded once, dignified despite the circumstances. Baxter looked back at the ID, then at Carter with a questioning expression that the younger officer either missed or ignored. "Need to get him processed," Carter insisted. Edward was led to a fingerprinting station, where his hands were uncuffed just long enough to press each finger onto an electronic scanner. The system was connected to national databases, standard procedure for all arrests. What wasn't standard was what would happen when those prints entered the system. Edward knew his fingerprints would trigger alerts in certain classified databases, but he wasn't sure how quickly the response would come or what form it would take. He was photographed, his personal items inventoried and placed in a plastic bin. "One phone call," Baxter said, gesturing to a phone on the wall. Edward dialed his daughter's number from memory. Lisa Thompson was a successful surgeon in Birmingham, specializing in cardiothoracic surgery. The call connected on the third ring. Dad, what's going on? You never call this time of day. Edward kept his voice steady. Lisa, I've been arrested in Oak Ridge. I'm at the sheriff's station. A beat of silence. What? On what charges? They're claiming suspicious behavior and questioning my prescription medication. It's clearly racial profiling. Edward could hear his daughter's sharp intake of breath, followed by the sounds of movement, papers rustling, a door closing. I'm on my way. Should be there in about an hour. Don't say anything else to them, okay? And Dad, should I call any of your old friends? Lisa knew enough about her father's former career to understand the implications. That won't be necessary, Edward replied, knowing the system would already be in motion. But thank you, sweetheart. After the call, Edward was led to a holding cell containing 2 other men, a young white man who appeared to be coming down from some substance and a middle-aged Latino man in work clothes. Both eyed Edward warily as he entered. The cell was small, with a single bench along the back wall and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. Edward sat on the bench, back straight, hands folded in his lap. The Latino man nodded respectfully. What they get you for, old-timer? Edward met his eyes. Existing while black, apparently. You? The man snorted. Broken taillight, but really working landscaping while Hispanic. He extended his hand. Carlos Rivera. Edward shook it. Edward Thompson. The young white man was watching them now, curiosity overcoming his initial wariness. You really don't look like you belong in here, man. Edward smiled slightly. I don't. And neither do you, gentlemen, I suspect. As Edward spoke with his cellmates, sharing stories of the everyday indignities faced by men of color in America, he was unaware that his fingerprints had already triggered a series of urgent alerts in a database few people knew existed. Comment number 1. If you think our justice system treats everyone equally, regardless of race, or comment number 2, if you believe racial bias still influences law enforcement today, have you ever stood up against injustice when you witnessed it, or remained silent like Officer Sullivan? Hit the like button if you believe in accountability for those who abuse their power, and subscribe to see what happens when a small-town arrest triggers a federal response. How quickly will the consequences of this wrongful arrest unfold? What will happen when Edward's true identity and importance come to light? In a windowless room deep within a nondescript government building in Langley, Virginia, screens illuminated the focused faces of intelligence analysts working the night shift. The Continuous Monitoring Initiative was a relatively new program designed to protect former intelligence assets with sensitive knowledge. Most of the alerts were routine, former analysts traveling internationally, financial anomalies that usually turned out to be nothing, occasional health emergencies. At precisely 2:47 in the afternoon, analyst Rachel Patel's screen flashed red, a Priority 1 alert accompanied by a soft but insistent beeping. System match. Fingerprint database. Subject: Thompson Edward J. Classification: Umbra. Patel sat up straight, immediately typing a series of commands to verify the match. The fingerprints had been entered into a sheriff's department system in Oak Ridge, Alabama, just minutes earlier. She turned to her supervisor, Commander Michael Carter. Sir, we have an Umbra alert on Thompson. Fingerprints just entered into a local law enforcement database in Alabama. He appears to be under arrest. Carter moved quickly to her station, scanning the alert details. Thompson. The Thompson who developed the Sentinel protocols? Yes, sir. The same. Carter immediately picked up a secure phone line. This is Commander Carter. Authorization code Sierra Victor 824. I need to speak with Director Hayes immediately. Priority 1 Umbra alert. Within 30 seconds, FBI Director Karen Hayes was on the line. Hayes had been with the Bureau for 27 years, working her way up from field agent to the highest position. She was known for her razor-sharp intelligence and unwavering integrity. She was also one of the few people who knew exactly who Edward Thompson was and what he had done for national security. "Carter, this better be important. I'm headed into a meeting with the AG. Director, Edward Thompson has been arrested by local law enforcement in Oak Ridge, Alabama. Fingerprints entered their system approximately 4 minutes ago." A beat of silence. "What are the charges?" "Unknown at this time. We're accessing their systems now." "Get me everything. And I mean everything. I want to know why one of our most valuable intelligence assets is sitting in a county jail. I want security footage, arrest reports, officer names. And Carter, get me a team ready. I'm going personally." "Yes, Director." As Carter began coordinating the response, Patel had already accessed the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department's computer system. The security was minimal compared to what she worked with daily. Within minutes, she had the arrest report and was accessing security camera footage. "Sir, preliminary report shows he was arrested by officers Ryan Carter and Jake Sullivan on suspicion of..." "This can't be right. Suspicious behavior and possession of what they claim might be illegal narcotics. The narcotics appear to be his prescription heart medication." Carter cursed under his breath. "Get me the footage." Patel pulled up the security camera feed from inside the station, showing Edward being processed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. Despite the circumstances, the 68-year-old former Chief Master Sergeant maintained perfect military posture, his face a mask of dignified calm. "Now find me footage of the arrest, if possible." And Patel typed rapidly, accessing traffic cameras and business security feeds near the location listed in the report. "There's a pharmacy camera that might have caught it, and it looks like multiple bystanders were recording on phones. Social media is already picking up videos of the incident." The pharmacy footage showed Edward being approached in the parking lot, the search of his car, and finally being handcuffed and placed in the police cruiser. Throughout the encounter, Edward's behavior was impeccably respectful and compliant. The officer's behavior, particularly Carter's, was clearly aggressive and unwarranted. "Get all of this to Director Hayes immediately," Carter ordered, his jaw tight with anger. "And pull everything we have on these officers and the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department." While the intelligence team worked, Director Hayes was already in motion. Few people in Washington knew that early in her career, Hayes had worked directly under Edward Thompson. It was Thompson who had identified her potential, mentored her, and ultimately saved her career after a mission in Eastern Europe went sideways. Everything she had accomplished since then, she owed in part to Edward Thompson's guidance and protection. Now, it was her turn to protect him. "I need a helicopter ready in 10 minutes, she barked into her phone as she strode through FBI headquarters. "And get me a tactical team. No, make that 2 teams. And call the Attorney General back. Tell him I'll have to reschedule. This is a national security matter." Within 15 minutes, Hayes was boarding an FBI helicopter, accompanied by 8 tactical agents and 2 senior officials from the Justice Department. As the helicopter lifted off, she reviewed the information coming in on her secure tablet. The Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department had a history of racial discrimination complaints that had never been properly addressed. Officer Carter, in particular, had 6 complaints filed against him in just under 3 years, all from Black or Hispanic residents, all dismissed without investigation. "Estimated time to Oak Ridge?" she asked the pilot. 27 minutes, Director." Hayes nodded, continuing to review the files. Edward Thompson's service record was legendary within certain circles of the intelligence community. 35 years in Air Force intelligence, rising to Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank. But his title hardly captured his importance. Thompson had developed counterterrorism protocols still in use today. He had personally advised 3 presidents on sensitive intelligence matters. His knowledge of classified operations spanning 4 decades made him one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the country, and potentially one of the most valuable targets for foreign operatives. Back in the holding cell in Oak Ridge, Edward sat calmly, unaware of the storm that was about to descend on the small sheriff's station. He engaged his cellmates in quiet conversation, learning about Carlos's children and the young man's struggles with addiction. Edward had always had a gift for getting people to open up, a skill that had served him well during his intelligence career. Meanwhile, Officer Sullivan stood at the front desk, a troubled expression on his face as he watched Sergeant Baxter typing at his computer. "Something wrong with the system?" Sullivan asked. Baxter frowned. "It's weird. Thompson's information has been flagged with some kind of federal hold, but the details are encrypted. I can't access them." Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should talk to Carter about this. Something doesn't feel right." Baxter nodded slowly. "Yeah, go get him. And Sullivan, between you and me, I've never seen this kind of flag before. Whatever's happening, it's way above our pay grade." Sheriff William Hayes arrived at the station just after 3:15, his heavy boots announcing his presence before he rounded the corner into the main area. At 58, Hayes had been sheriff of Oak Ridge County for 17 years, running unopposed for the last 3 elections. He was a large man with a florid face and thinning gray hair, respected by most and feared by some. "Someone want to tell me why I'm getting calls about one of my deputies arresting an old man at Carter's pharmacy?" he demanded, looking around the room. Sergeant Baxter gestured toward the back. "Carter brought in a 68-year-old black male, sir. Claimed suspicious behavior and possible narcotics, but it looks like prescription medication to me." Hayes frowned. "And this is enough commotion for the mayor to call me directly because—" Carter appeared from the break room, coffee in hand. "Sheriff, I was just doing my job. This guy matched the description of a suspect in that convenience store robbery." Hayes fixed Carter with a hard stare. "What convenience store robbery would that be, Deputy? Last robbery we had was 3 weeks ago, and the perp was a 20-something white kid hooked on Oxy." Carter's confidence faltered slightly. "Well, there were reports of suspicious activity in the area, and this guy was just hanging around the pharmacy parking lot, watching people." Sullivan, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Hayes gestured for the arrest report, which Baxter handed over. As he read, his expression darkened. "You arrested a 68-year-old Air Force veteran with a spotless record because he was watching people while loading groceries into his car?" He flipped to the next page, then stopped, staring at the copy of Edward's military ID. "Chief Master Sergeant, 35 years of service." He looked up at Carter. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Carter's face reddened. "With respect, sir, military service doesn't mean he can't be involved in criminal activity, and the pills he had don't look like any heart medication I've ever seen." Hayes pointed a thick finger at Carter. "You stay right here. Sullivan, come with me." The sheriff and Officer Sullivan walked to the security monitor displaying the holding cells. Edward sat on the bench, back straight, engaged in what appeared to be a friendly conversation with the other detainees. "Tell me exactly what happened," Hayes said quietly. Sullivan hesitated, glancing back toward where Carter waited. Carter said he spotted suspicious behavior. The subject was just loading groceries, as far as I could tell. When we approached, he was completely respectful, showed ID without protest. Carter insisted on searching his car without consent or probable cause, found prescription medication, and claimed it looked suspicious. And you went along with this?" Sullivan looked at his shoes. I should have spoken up more clearly, sir." Hayes nodded slowly. "Yes, You should have. He turned to Baxter. What's the status on processing him? Baxter looked uncomfortable. That's another thing, sir. When his prints went into the system, some kind of federal flag came up. I can't access the details. It's encrypted. Hayes frowned. Federal flag? What the hell did Carter just step in? The station phone rang, and Baxter answered it. After a brief conversation, he held out the receiver to Hayes. It's Lisa Thompson, sir, the detainee's daughter. Says she's a surgeon in Birmingham and has a colonel from the Pentagon on another line who wants to speak with you. Hayes's face went pale as he took the phone. This is Sheriff Hayes. He listened for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly grave. Yes, sir, I understand. Yes, sir. We'll cooperate fully. When he hung up, he turned to Baxter. Pull all of Carter's arrest records for the past year, every single one, and get me the complaint files too. Baxter hesitated. Sir, most of those complaints were dismissed without— I know what happened to them. Get them anyway. While Baxter worked, Hayes reviewed the security footage from the pharmacy, his face darkening further with each minute. Carter's body camera footage was even more damning, clearly showing racial bias in both his language and actions. When Carter referred to Edward as boy at one point during the search, Hayes slammed his hand on the desk. He called Carter into his office, closing the door behind them. Through the glass, the officers could see Hayes shouting, his face red with anger. Carter initially appeared defiant, then increasingly defensive as the conversation continued. Meanwhile, Sullivan had pulled Baxter aside. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. This isn't the first time Carter has done this. He specifically targets black residents, especially ones who look like they don't belong here, as he puts it. He's planted evidence before. Nothing major, just small amounts of marijuana or pills, but enough to justify arrests. Baxter stared at him. And you're just saying this now? Sullivan looked ashamed. I know. I should have reported it before. He's my partner, and Baxter shook his head in disgust. You better tell the sheriff everything. And I mean everything. Outside the station, a small crowd had begun to gather. Word of Edward's arrest had spread quickly through Oak Ridge's black community. Local pastor Reverend Jeremiah King was speaking with reporters from the Oak Ridge Tribune, while several young people held hastily made signs reading "Justice for Our Veterans" and "Black Lives Matter in Oak Ridge." Inside Hayes's office, the confrontation with Carter had reached a breaking point. You falsified a report, conducted an illegal search, and arrested a decorated veteran without cause, Hayes shouted. And now I've got the goddamn Pentagon calling my station. Carter's facade finally cracked. He was just another uppity and— Hayes slammed his hand on the desk again. That's it. Turn in your badge and gun. You're suspended pending investigation. Carter's face contorted with rage. For what? Doing my job? Keeping this town safe from people who don't belong here? People like Chief Master Sergeant Edward Thompson, a man who served this country for 35 years while you were still in diapers? Carter threw his badge on the desk. This town's going to hell anyway. All these outsiders moving in, thinking they're better than us. As Carter stormed out of the office, Sullivan approached the sheriff. Sir, there's something else you should know about Carter's previous arrests. Before he could continue, Baxter called out from the front desk. Sheriff, you need to see this! Hayes hurried over to find Baxter staring at his computer screen, which displayed an incoming message marked, Urgent, Federal Priority. FBI helicopters just requested emergency landing clearance at the municipal airfield. ETA 5 minutes. They're coming here, sir. Hayes ran a hand over his face. Jesus Christ. What the hell has Carter done? As if in answer, the station's fax machine began printing page after page of federal documentation. Baxter grabbed the first sheet, his eyes widening as he read. "Sir, this is a Department of Justice Civil Rights Investigation authorization. They're taking over the station." Through the windows, they could see news vans pulling up outside, joining the growing crowd of concerned citizens. In the distance, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the humid Alabama afternoon, growing louder by the second. Sheriff Hayes straightened his uniform and squared his shoulders. "Baxter, bring Thompson to my office now. Sullivan, gather all documentation related to this arrest and Carter's previous activities. If the feds are coming in force like this, there's a hell of a lot more to Thompson than just his military record." As Baxter hurried to the holding cells, Sullivan looked out the window at the gathering crowd, then back to the papers continuing to spill from the fax machine. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think this is just the beginning." Edward Thompson sat across from Sheriff Hayes, still handcuffed, despite the sheriff's suddenly respectful demeanor. The office was small but neat, with fishing trophies and family photos competing for space on the crowded shelves. A large county map dominated one wall, with colorful pins marking incidents that now seemed trivial compared to what was unfolding. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes began, his voice carefully modulated, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you've received today. There appears to have been a significant error in judgment by Officer Carter." Edward regarded the sheriff calmly. "Is that what you call racial profiling now, Sheriff? An error in judgment?" Hayes had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Sir, I assure you that the actions of one officer don't reflect the values of this department." "Don't they?" Edward's voice remained even, but his eyes were penetrating. "Officer Carter has 6 previous complaints of racial discrimination, all dismissed without investigation. That suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident." Hayes blinked in surprise. "How did you know about those complaints?" A small smile touched Edward's lips. "Sheriff, I spent 35 years in intelligence work. Analyzing patterns and gathering information was my specialty." For the first time, Hayes seemed to truly comprehend who he was dealing with. "Your military ID indicates you were a Chief Master Sergeant in Air Force Intelligence." Edward nodded once. "That's correct. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? The federal alert that came up when we ran your fingerprints. The Pentagon calling my office directly." Hayes leaned forward. "Just who are you, Mr. Thompson?" Edward considered the question carefully. Most of his career remained classified, but certain elements had been declassified over time. "I served as a senior intelligence advisor to 3 presidents, Sheriff. I developed counterterrorism protocols still in use today. My security clearance was, and in some ways still is, among the highest in the nation." As Edward spoke, memories of his extraordinary career flashed through his mind. Saigon, 1971. A young technical Sergeant Thompson, identifying a pattern in enemy communications that saved an entire battalion from ambush. Berlin, 1983. Master Sergeant Thompson extracting a high-value defector during the height of Cold War tensions. Washington, 1991. Senior Master Sergeant Thompson briefing President Bush on intelligence related to Operation Desert Storm. Baghdad, 2003. Chief Master Sergeant Thompson developing the signal intelligence framework that would later prevent 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil. Through it all, Edward had served with distinction, often as the only black man in rooms where crucial national security decisions were made. He had endured slights, overcome prejudice, and proven his exceptional value to the nation time and again. Yet here he sat, handcuffed in a small-town sheriff's office, arrested for the crime of being black in public. Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to release you immediately with all charges dropped. We can consider this matter closed and avoid any further complications." Edward fixed the sheriff with a steady gaze. "I'm afraid it's far too late for that, Sheriff. The proper procedures must be followed now. My rights were violated, and Officer Carter should be held accountable through official channels." Hayes's face reddened. "Mr. Thompson, I'm trying to resolve this situation amicably. There's no need to escalate matters further." "Escalation began the moment Officer Carter approached me without cause, Sheriff. What you're experiencing now is simply consequence." The door burst open, and Officer Carter stormed in, his face contorted with anger. "This is bull, Sheriff! You're going to throw away my career over this guy?" He gestured dismissively at Edward. "He was acting suspicious, and I did my job." Hayes stood quickly. "Carter, you're suspended. You have no business being in here." Carter ignored him, focusing his rage on Edward. "You think you're special because you were in the military? I've arrested veterans before. You people always think you deserve special treatment." Sheriff Hayes moved around the desk. "Carter, that's enough. Get out of my office now." "You people," Edward repeated quietly, his dignity in stark contrast to Carter's unraveling composure. "I've served this country for 35 years, protected its secrets, advised its leaders, and developed systems that have saved countless American lives. And still, to you, I'm just you people." Carter's face twisted with undisguised racism. "You think your fancy military career matters? You don't belong in this town. People like you are ruining places like Oak Ridge, coming in and acting like—" "Officer Carter!" Sullivan's voice cut through the tirade as he appeared in the doorway. "That's enough." All eyes turned to Sullivan, who stood straight-backed for perhaps the first time in his career. "Sheriff, I need to officially report that Officer Carter has previously planted evidence on suspects, specifically targeting black residents. I've witnessed it multiple times and failed to report it. I'm prepared to provide full details for the record." Carter lunged toward Sullivan. "You backstabbing little—" Sheriff Hayes and another deputy quickly restrained Carter, who continued shouting obscenities as they dragged him from the office. In the sudden quiet that followed, Edward looked at Sullivan. "It takes courage to stand up for what's right, Officer Sullivan. Late is better than never." Sullivan met Edward's eyes briefly before looking away, shame evident in his expression. "I should have said something long ago, sir." The wail of approaching sirens filled the air, joining the now constant sound of helicopter rotors overhead. Sheriff Hayes returned, his face grave. "Mr. Thompson, it appears the FBI has arrived in force. Director Hayes herself is leading the operation." Edward nodded, unsurprised. "Karen always was thorough." You know the FBI director personally?" Hayes asked, his voice faint. Before Edward could respond, the building seemed to shudder as the front doors burst open. Raised voices echoed down the hallway, federal authorities identifying themselves and taking control of the station. Sheriff Hayes sank back into his chair, the full weight of the situation finally settling on his shoulders. "This department is finished, isn't it?" Edward regarded him thoughtfully. "That depends on what you do next, Sheriff. Corruption festers in silence and darkness. Perhaps this is an opportunity to bring things into the light." Comment number 1. If you believe one person standing up for justice can create meaningful change in a broken system, have you ever witnessed someone finding the courage to speak truth to power, like Officer Sullivan finally did? Hit the like button if you believe accountability is essential in our justice system, and subscribe to see how this confrontation reaches its dramatic conclusion. The FBI has arrived, but will justice truly be served? What will happen when Edward Thompson finally comes face to face with FBI Director Hayes, and what does their shared history mean for the future of Oak Ridge? The double doors of the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Station crashed open with military precision as FBI agents in tactical gear poured into the building. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing exits and establishing a perimeter within seconds. Behind them strode FBI Director Karen Hayes, her tailored suit and commanding presence immediately drawing all eyes in the room. She was flanked by 2 senior Justice Department officials and followed by a team of agents carrying electronic equipment and document cases. "This is a federal intervention," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "By order of the Attorney General of the United States, this department is temporarily under FBI authority, pending investigation." She scanned the room until her eyes locked on Sheriff Hayes' office. Without hesitation, she crossed the room, agents parting before her. When she entered the office and saw Edward Thompson sitting handcuffed, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Remove those immediately," she ordered a nearby agent, who quickly unlocked the handcuffs. Edward rubbed his wrists, nodding his thanks. "Hello, Karen. It's been a while." Director Hayes' expression softened momentarily. "Chief, you look well, despite the circumstances." Sheriff Hayes stared between them in bewilderment. "You two know each other?" Hayes turned her attention to the sheriff, her expression hardening again. "Sheriff William Hayes. I'm FBI Director Karen Hayes. And yes, Chief Master Sergeant Thompson and I have known each other for 22 years. She placed a folder on his desk. "This is a federal order authorizing the FBI to assume temporary control of this department for investigation of civil rights violations. I suggest you cooperate fully." As the sheriff reviewed the documents with shaking hands, Edward and Director Hayes exchanged a look filled with shared history. 22 years earlier, Hayes had been a promising young FBI agent assigned to a joint task force with military intelligence. Edward, then a senior master sergeant, had been put in charge of the operation targeting a terrorist cell planning attacks on American embassies in Eastern Europe. The mission had gone sideways when Hayes' cover was compromised. It was Edward who identified the leak, extracted Hayes from an impossible situation, and, most crucially, shielded her from the political fallout that followed. When senior officials sought a scapegoat, Edward stood firm, putting his own distinguished career at risk to protect the young agent he recognized as exceptional. That intervention had allowed Hayes to rise through the ranks unimpeded, eventually reaching the Bureau's highest position. "Medical team," Hayes called, gesturing to Edward's wrists, which showed bruising from the tight handcuffs. As paramedics entered to examine him, Hayes turned back to Sheriff Hayes. "I want all records related to Officer Ryan Carter's arrests for the past 3 years. All body camera footage, all complaint forms, all internal reviews. My team will require full access to your systems and facilities." Sheriff Hayes nodded numbly. "Of course, Director. We'll cooperate fully." As agents were already setting up equipment, accessing the station's computer systems, and securing evidence. Outside, more FBI vehicles arrived, along with news vans and a growing crowd of townspeople. Edward's daughter, Lisa, pushed through the front doors, her scrubs rumpled from the hasty drive from Birmingham. When she saw her father being treated by paramedics, she rushed forward. "Dad, are you okay?" Edward embraced his daughter. "I'm fine, Lisa. Just some sore wrists." He nodded toward Director Hayes. "You remember Karen?" Lisa's eyes widened in recognition. "Director Hayes, it's been years." Hayes shook her hand. "Your father is being treated with the respect he deserves now, Ms. Thompson. I promise you this situation will be thoroughly investigated." While Edward spoke with his daughter and received medical attention, Hayes coordinated the federal response. Teams of agents spread throughout the station, securing records and interviewing personnel. Officer Carter was taken into federal custody, still shouting protests as he was led to an FBI vehicle. Officer Sullivan sat in a conference room, giving a detailed statement about Carter's history of misconduct and his own failure to report it. In the sheriff's office, Hayes confronted Sheriff Hayes directly. Your department has a documented pattern of racial discrimination that you've systematically ignored. Officers under your command have violated the civil rights of citizens you swore to protect. Sheriff Hayes slumped in his chair. Director, I never authorized any of this. Your authorization wasn't necessary. Your willful blindness was sufficient. Hayes leaned forward. Sheriff, this isn't just about what happened today. This is about a culture of discrimination that has been allowed to flourish under your leadership. As the federal investigation unfolded inside, the scene outside the station grew more charged. Reverend King led community members in prayer, while activists chanted for justice. Local media interviewed witnesses from the pharmacy parking lot, their cell phone videos of Edward's arrest now playing on news stations across the state. Edward's military colleagues began arriving, having heard about the incident through their networks. Retired Colonel David Marshall, Edward's former commanding officer, pushed through the crowd, his military bearing unmistakable despite civilian clothes. When he entered the station and saw Edward, he saluted sharply before embracing his old friend. These small-town cops had no idea who they were messing with, did they, Chief? Edward shook his head. It shouldn't matter who I am, David. No citizen should be treated this way. As evening approached, Director Hayes called a brief press conference outside the station. Edward stood beside her, his dignified presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. The FBI has launched a formal civil rights investigation into the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department, Hayes announced to the assembled reporters and citizens. What happened today to Chief Master Sergeant Edward Thompson is unacceptable in America. No one, regardless of their service record or position, should face discrimination based on the color of their skin. But it is especially egregious when it happens to someone who has given 35 years of distinguished service to this nation. She turned to Edward. Would you like to say a few words, Chief? Edward stepped forward, his military bearing evident despite the ordeal. Today, I experienced what too many Black Americans experience every day. The difference is that I have connections that brought immediate consequences. Most victims of racial profiling don't have an FBI director who comes to their aid. They suffer in silence, their dignity stripped, their rights violated. He looked out at the gathered crowd. If there is any good to come from today's events, let it be that Oak Ridge confronts the reality of racial bias in its institutions. Let it be that one more community begins the hard work of ensuring equal justice for all its citizens. As Edward finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause. Behind him, Director Hayes watched with pride, remembering the young intelligence officer who had taught her that integrity wasn't just about following rules, but about standing firmly for what was right, regardless of personal cost. Inside the station, the investigation continued through the night. Evidence mounted of systematic discrimination under Sheriff Hayes's leadership. Officer Sullivan's testimony revealed dozens of instances of misconduct by Carter and others. And in Washington, the Attorney General personally briefed the president on the situation involving one of the nation's most valuable intelligence veterans. 6 weeks after what Oak Ridge residents now simply called the incident, the consequences continued to ripple through the small Alabama town. The Department of Justice had completed the initial phase of its civil rights investigation, resulting in formal charges against Officer Ryan Carter for multiple civil rights violations. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory policing that extended beyond Carter to several other officers and department policies. Sheriff William Hayes had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, his once secure position now in jeopardy as evidence mounted of his willful ignorance of discrimination within his department. The Oak Ridge Town Council chambers were packed for the emergency session called to address the crisis. Edward Thompson sat in the front row, composed and attentive, as Mayor Sarah Bennett outlined the steps being taken to reform the Sheriff's Department. "We have entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice," the mayor announced, her voice solemn. "This agreement will require comprehensive reforms in our law enforcement practices, including new training protocols, community oversight, and transparent complaint procedures." The audience murmured as the mayor continued. Additionally, Officer Jake Sullivan has resigned from the department and has agreed to testify in the federal case against Officer Carter. He has also accepted a position with the newly formed Community Oversight Board. Edward glanced across the room to where Sullivan sat, looking both nervous and relieved. Their eyes met briefly, and Edward gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The young man had made the difficult choice to break the blue wall of silence, and while it came too late to prevent Edward's humiliation, it might help prevent future injustices. Outside the town hall, Oak Ridge remained divided over the federal intervention. Some residents, particularly in the white community, resented the scrutiny and defended the sheriff's department. Signs reading, "Support our local police" and "Federal overreach" appeared in some yards. But in the black community, and among many younger residents, the investigation was seen as long overdue. Edward had become a reluctant symbol for both sides. Either a respected veteran wronged by overzealous federal authorities, or a catalyst for necessary change. In the weeks following his arrest, Edward had received numerous calls and visits from former military colleagues. His small home on Cedar Lane had hosted generals, intelligence officials, and even a former Secretary of Defense, all coming to express their outrage at his treatment and offer support. Edward appreciated their concern, but remained focused on the larger issues at stake. He had established the Oak Ridge Community Justice Foundation, using his connections and newfound public platform to address systemic inequalities in law enforcement. Working with his daughter, Lisa, Edward developed programs to provide legal assistance to victims of discrimination and to create dialogue between law enforcement and minority communities. On a warm Saturday morning, Edward stood before a gathered crowd at Oak Ridge Community Park, officially launching the Foundation's first initiative, a scholarship program for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement or criminal justice. "Change comes not just from identifying what's wrong," Edward told the assembled residents, "but from actively building what's right. We need more diverse voices in our justice system, voices that understand the communities they serve." Among those attending was Officer Sullivan, now working with the Oversight Board while pursuing a degree in social work. His testimony against former colleagues had made him an outcast among many officers, but had earned him respect from community leaders committed to reform. Meanwhile, in a federal detention center awaiting trial, Ryan Carter seethed with resentment. His initial bravado had crumbled as the evidence against him mounted. Body camera footage, witness statements, and Sullivan's testimony had revealed a consistent pattern of targeting black residents. Carter's lawyer had suggested a plea deal, but Carter refused, still unable to recognize the gravity of his actions or the harm he had caused. The national media had seized on the story, painting Oak Ridge as a microcosm of America's ongoing struggle with racial justice. Edward had given several carefully considered interviews, always steering the conversation away from his personal ordeal and toward the systemic issues it revealed. His military background and dignified bearing made him a compelling spokesperson, someone whose patriotism could not be questioned, even as he called for fundamental reforms. 4 months after the arrest, Edward received a phone call from the White House. The president wanted to meet with him to discuss police reform initiatives at the federal level. As Edward packed for the trip to Washington, he reflected on the strange turn his retirement had taken. He had moved to Oak Ridge seeking quiet and anonymity after a career spent in the shadows of national security. Now he found himself in the spotlight, using his voice for those who often went unheard. The day before his White House meeting, Edward visited FBI headquarters at Director Hayes' invitation. They sat in her office, reminiscing about their shared past and discussing the changes unfolding in Oak Ridge. "You've turned a personal injustice into a movement for change, Chief," Hayes said, genuine admiration in her voice. "That doesn't surprise me. You always saw the bigger picture." Edward smiled slightly. "I had good mentors who taught me that responsibility doesn't end with identifying problems. It requires building solutions." He paused, looking out her window at the Washington skyline. "You know, throughout my career, I faced discrimination, even while holding the highest clearances and briefing presidents. The uniform and rank provided some protection, but never immunity. What happened in Oak Ridge was just a more blatant version of what many of us experience throughout our lives." Hayes nodded soberly. "The Bureau still has work to do on that front as well. Your case has prompted some overdue conversations here too." Back in Oak Ridge, the community continued its difficult journey toward healing and reform. The consent decree had forced uncomfortable conversations about race and policing. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new requirements. Others embraced the changes, recognizing the opportunity to better serve their entire community. Edward's foundation had become a bridge between divided factions, providing a neutral space for dialogue and reconciliation. 6 months to the day after Edward's arrest, the Justice Department announced formal indictments against Carter and 2 other former Oak Ridge officers. Sheriff Hayes avoided criminal charges but was forced to resign. The announcement made national news, with legal experts citing the case as an example of the Justice Department's renewed commitment to civil rights enforcement. That evening, Edward sat on his porch, watching the sunset over Oak Ridge. His phone rang continuously with calls from reporters seeking comment, but he let them go to voicemail. This moment of reflection was for himself, alone. The injustice he had suffered had opened wounds, both personal and communal. But in that pain, there was also possibility. The possibility of healing that went beyond surface remedies to address deeper inequities. Edward thought of all the Black men and women who had faced similar discrimination without the benefit of his connections and public platform. Their stories often went untold, their suffering unaddressed. In using his voice for them, he had found new purpose in his retirement years. As darkness fell over the town, Edward Thompson made a silent promise to continue the work for as long as necessary. The path to justice was long, but after 35 years of serving his country from the shadows, he was prepared to walk this new path in the light. 1 year to the day after Edward Thompson's wrongful arrest, Oak Ridge had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The small Alabama town had become an unlikely model for police reform, with law enforcement agencies from across the South sending representatives to study the changes implemented under the Justice Department consent decree. On this anniversary, Edward stood at a podium in the newly dedicated Community Justice Center, addressing a diverse gathering of residents, officials, and media. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, his military bearing undiminished by age or the events of the past year. "A year ago today, I was handcuffed and humiliated for the crime of existing while Black in America," Edward began, his deep voice carrying through the packed auditorium. "Today, we gather not to dwell on that injustice, but to celebrate the progress that has risen from it." He gestured to the modern facility around them, built with federal grants and donations from across the country. This center represents our community's commitment to equal justice, to transparent policing, and to healing the divisions that have kept us from truly seeing one another. The audience included Oak Ridge's new sheriff, Maria Alvarez, the first woman and first Hispanic person to hold the position. Beside her sat Jake Sullivan, now director of the Community Oversight Board, and completing his master's degree in criminal justice reform. Even some of Edward's former military colleagues had traveled to Oak Ridge for the occasion, including 3 generals and FBI Director Karen Hayes, who had become a regular visitor to the town. The journey to this moment had not been easy. The federal trial of former Officer Ryan Carter had divided Oak Ridge, with painful testimony revealing the extent of discriminatory policing that had flourished under the previous administration. Carter had eventually been convicted on multiple civil rights violations and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. His supporters still maintained he had been scapegoated, but their voices had diminished as the evidence of his misconduct became impossible to ignore. The reform process had forced Oak Ridge to confront uncomfortable truths about its history and institutions. Town hall meetings had often grown heated, with some residents resisting changes they saw as federal overreach. Edward had stood firm through these conflicts, always redirecting the conversation from personal grievances to systemic solutions. His Oak Ridge Community Justice Foundation had expanded beyond its initial goals, now offering programs in conflict resolution, legal aid, and community policing. Most significantly, it had established a citizen review board with actual oversight authority, ensuring that complaints against officers would never again be summarily dismissed. As Edward continued his address, he acknowledged the complexity of the journey. Reform is never simple or painless. It requires us to examine assumptions we've held for generations. It demands that we listen to voices we have previously silenced. And it asks us to imagine a justice system that truly serves all citizens equally. He paused, looking out at the audience. But the rewards of this difficult work are evident today in an Oak Ridge that is more united, more just, and more committed to the true meaning of community than at any time in our history. After the ceremony, Edward met privately with several families whose cases of police misconduct had previously been ignored. With the help of Edward's foundation and his daughter Lisa's legal expertise, these cases had been reopened, resulting in cleared records, compensation, and formal apologies from the department. One elderly woman clasped Edward's hands in hers. "Before you came to Oak Ridge, nobody listened to us," she said, tears in her eyes. "Now they can't ignore us anymore." That evening, Edward hosted a small gathering at his home for those who had been instrumental in the reform process. Director Hayes raised a toast to her former mentor, to Edward Thompson, who turned personal injustice into community transformation. Edward smiled, but shook his head slightly. The transformation came from many hands working together. I was just the catalyst. Hayes raised an eyebrow. A catalyst that happened to have the ear of 3 former presidents and half the Pentagon. The group laughed, but Edward remained thoughtful. His military career had taught him that true leadership wasn't about personal recognition, but about creating conditions where others could succeed. He had applied that same principle to Oak Ridge's reform movement, using his connections and platform to amplify local voices rather than replace them. The next morning, Edward drove to the Oak Ridge Cemetery to visit Clara's grave, as he did every week. He sat beside the headstone, telling her about the ceremony and the progress the town had made. "You would have been proud, Clara," he said softly, "not of the recognition, but of the change. That's what always mattered to you." On his drive back home, Edward passed Carter's Pharmacy, the site of his arrest a year earlier. The business had new ownership now. The previous pharmacist had sold the store after it was revealed that he had been the one to call the police that day, falsely reporting suspicious behavior. Edward continued through town, noting the changes both visible and invisible. The sheriff's department vehicles now carried body cameras, and displayed the department's new motto: to protect, serve, and respect. Community policing officers walked beats in all neighborhoods, not just the wealthy ones. Training on implicit bias and de-escalation was now mandatory and ongoing. Most importantly, a sense of cautious trust was beginning to replace the fear that had characterized relations between law enforcement and Oak Ridge's black community for generations. As Edward pulled into his driveway, he noticed a delivery man approaching with a package. The young man, who was black, moved with the wary body language Edward recognized all too well. The careful movements of someone who had learned to navigate a world where their presence alone could be perceived as threatening. Edward greeted him warmly, accepting the package and engaging him in brief conversation. The young man mentioned he was new to Oak Ridge, having moved from Birmingham for the lower cost of living. "How do you find it here?" Edward asked. The delivery man shrugged. "Better than I expected. Police actually smiled and waved at me yesterday, instead of following me around. That's new." Edward nodded, understanding the significance of this small interaction. Things are changing, slowly, but they're changing. After the delivery man left, Edward sat on his porch, opening the package to find a bound copy of the Justice Department's final report on Oak Ridge's reforms. The cover letter, signed by the Attorney General himself, cited the town as an emerging national model for community-centered police reform. Edward leafed through the document, noting both the progress acknowledged and the work still to be done. His phone rang, his daughter Lisa calling from Birmingham. "Dad, have you seen the news? The president is citing Oak Ridge in his speech on police reform today. They're using the Oversight Board as a model for national legislation." Edward smiled. "That's good news. The more departments adopt these changes, the fewer Edward Thompsons will end up in handcuffs for living their lives." "You could have just retired quietly, you know," Lisa said, a note of pride in her voice. "Played golf? Written your memoirs?" Edward chuckled. "You know, I never liked golf. And as for memoirs, I think I'm still writing that story." As the sun set over Oak Ridge, Edward Thompson reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. His 35 years of military service had prepared him to face crises with calm determination. His experiences with discrimination throughout his life had taught him resilience. And now, in what should have been his quiet retirement years, he had found a new mission just as important as any he'd undertaken for his country. The wrongful arrest that had humiliated him had ultimately empowered an entire community to demand change. The system that had failed him was being rebuilt, imperfectly, but genuinely, into something more just. And Edward Thompson, who had spent his career in the shadows protecting American ideals, was now helping to fulfill those ideals in the clear light of day. What do you think about Edward's approach to turning injustice into positive change? Would you have had his patience and dignity in the face of discrimination? Comment below with your thoughts. If Edward's story of resilience and transformation inspired you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Edward Thompson's extraordinary story. And remember, true justice requires not just good laws, but good people willing to uphold them. Edward Thompson's story teaches us that dignity and integrity can triumph even in the face of injustice. His calm, commanding presence, cultivated through decades of military service, proved more powerful than the prejudice he encountered. The incident demonstrates how racial discrimination persists in America, regardless of one's service to country. Yet it also shows that systemic change is possible when brave individuals stand up for what's right. Officer Sullivan's evolution reminds us that silence enables injustice, while speaking truth to power, though difficult, creates possibility for redemption and reform. The community's transformation illustrates that confronting uncomfortable truths about racism can lead to healing and progress. Perhaps most importantly, Edward's response to injustice offers a blueprint for effective advocacy. Using personal pain as motivation for systemic change, building bridges across divided communities, and creating institutions that outlast individual efforts. His story shows that true justice requires not just accountability for wrongdoing, but the creation of new systems that prevent future harm. What would you do if faced with discrimination? Would you have Edward's courage to transform personal injustice into community change? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story of dignity prevailing against racism moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and resilience. Share with someone who needs inspiration to stand against discrimination. Thank you for witnessing Edward's journey. Remember that every community has the potential for transformation when good people refuse to accept injustice.